everyone! Today I'm back with another 1950s inspired project. This one has the same sleeve design as my previous dress, where it's incorporated into the bodice pattern rather than being a separate piece, but it has different seaming at the front along with a cute collar and bow. This video will cover the process of making the bodice of the dress, and there should be a second video up in the coming weeks that shows how I made the bottom half. If you want to see how I did it, then keep on watching. For this project, I'm using 1.5 yards of yellow gingham, which I picked up from Joann's. And for lining, I'm using some white broadcloth. And for some decoration, I'm using some cotton embroidered trim. Before construction could begin, I had to draft the pattern, and I did this by sketching out the arm sky onto the fabric, then pinning it onto my dress form. I pulled the fabric tightly over the form, then cut the center back to be straight. I used a pen to mark the neckline, then trimmed away the excess fabric. The process was similar for the front, just pulling the fabric tightly and pinning it to the form. Excess material beneath the bust was pinned into a dart. I also marked the waistline and trimmed away some of the excess material. I pinned another piece of fabric, this time to the center front of the form, then pulled and pinned it tightly to the form and drew out the seam lines. I cut around those lines and that finished the base pattern. Draping the collar was a similar process, pinning it over the form, then drawing the shape I wanted onto it. Here it is finished. I removed the pieces from the form, trimmed the edges more precisely, and ironed them. Then I transferred the pieces onto paper and added seam allowances. I'm sorry I didn't film the process. It's difficult to do since I stand right in front of the dress form when I'm draping. It's also a relatively intuitive process when you get started, which makes it a bit challenging to explain. But I hope that gives you a better understanding of how I created this pattern and how I create most of my patterns. I pinned the bodice pattern onto the gingham material, and I pinned the pieces so they were all in the same vertical grain line of the fabric. Then I cut them out. The pins were all removed, but before removing the pattern from the fabric, I used a pencil to mark the darts. I just marked a dot at the base of the darts and at the top. Then I used a ruler to connect the dots after the pattern was removed. The whole process was repeated, this time with the lining. I started by pinning the bodice pattern to the broadcloth, then cutting it out. I also cut out the collar. I originally cut it from the broadcloth, but I didn't think that texture was interesting enough, so I recut it from cotton sateen later on. After removing the pins, I marked the darts onto the back side of the lining, using the same process that was used on the gingham. The final thing to do was cutting the cotton trim. It was too wide for the delicate look I was going for, so I marked a line 1 inch away from its edge. Then I cut along the line. I pinned the smaller strips of trim onto both sides of the front panel, with the right side of the trim facing the right side of the fabric. I sewed the lace to the front panel a 1/4 inch away from the edge, and I'm doing this so the lace won't shift when I sew the front panel to the side panels, so the stitching doesn't have to be particularly precise. Now it was time to pin the darts. I did this by lining up the markings I made at the base of the dart. Then I made sure each pin used to secure the dart went through the pencil lines on both sides of the fabric. And I kept checking both sides of the fabric to make sure everything lined up nicely, because I wanted these to be as symmetrical as possible. This is important because the more symmetrical the darts, the better the fit will be and the better the bodice will look. I removed the pins as I went and sewed across the pencil lines marking the darts. And I continued the stitching past the point where the dart ends, because I find this gives the smoothest look once the dart is ironed. I pinned the side panels of the bodice to the front panel. I repeated this process with the lining. I sewed these pieces together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After ironing those seams, I top stitched as close to the edge of the front panel of the gingham layer as I could. This gives a nice finish and helps keep the lace situated the way I want it. I clipped the curved edges at the side seams, then I pinned the front panel to the back panels. And I repeated this process with the lining layers. I sewed these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I sewed the shoulder seams once again with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If this process seems familiar, that's probably because this is exactly what I did with the polka dot 1950s inspired dress that I made recently. This bodice has a very similar shape and construction method to that dress, even though the pattern is quite different. I pinned the lining and gingham layers together with the right sides facing each other, and I pinned along the neckline and back edges. Then I sewed across those edges with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After trimming the corners and clipping across the curved edges, I turned the bodice the right way out. I pinned along the edges once again until the fabric was situated nicely. Then I sewed across those edges. I didn't do a very precise job of this since all the edges will be covered or sewn into seams later on. I turned the lining of the sleeves inward by a little more than a 1/2 inch, then sewed it down. I turned the gingham layer inward as well and pinned it to the lining so all the raw edges are hidden. I sewed across the edge to secure the lining to the outer layer. Now I moved on to the collar. I wanted to get the corners as even as possible, so I drew myself some guidelines with a pencil. Then I pinned the collar and collar lining together with the right sides facing each other. I sewed the pieces together with the 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I left the top edge of each panel open so I can turn the collar the right way out. I clipped the corners, then turned the collar the right way out. I sewed around each edge of the collar as close to the edge of the material as I possibly could, and even though I pinned everything carefully and drew myself guidelines, the collar isn't as even as I would have liked. I think in future I would interface the panels first, since stiffer fabrics can be a bit more forgiving and easier to shape. I finished the top edge of the collar pieces with lace binding. The collar pieces were pinned onto the bodice with the right side of the collar facing the wrong side of the bodice. Then I sewed the collar on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The final thing I had to do was make the tie. I did this by cutting out 2 30-inch long strips that were 4.5 inches wide. I pinned the strips into tubes with the right sides facing each other. Then I sewed across the long edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I shifted the seam allowance to be in the center of the strips and sewed diagonally across one end. I clipped the corner of the diagonally cut end, then used my fingers to turn the strips the right way out. Once I reached the end, I used a pin to make sure the corners on the finished end were nice and pointy. After the strips were turned the right way out, I ironed them, then pinned the strips to the top of the back of the bodice. These strips are pulled underneath the collar and tied at the front in a bow. And that's it for this video. If you liked this video and haven't seen my other making of videos, then I will have a playlist of them linked down below, along with a bunch more information about the materials I used in this video. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I shall talk to you all very soon.